You know how it is, you really want to get to grips with something, dig beneath all the noise, right?
Yeah.
Especially with topics like these short-term mission trips we hear so much about. We've all heard the quick takes. Life-changing.
Right. I learned more than I gave.
Exactly. Or maybe sat through a youth group slideshow or two.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what this deep dive is about today.
Okay.
One of you, actually a listener, keen on understanding the nuances, shared a really interesting piece with us.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it analyzes the narratives that come out of these short-term mission trip experiences. So think of us kind of exploring the stories behind those first impressions.
Right. So our mission, if you will,
Yeah.
for this deep dive is to really understand the main stories that get told about these trips, these STMs. We want to look at how the participants, make sense of what happened.
Yeah.
And maybe shine a light on the parts that, well, don't always get talked about.
Exactly. And the author of this piece we're looking at, they start by noticing some really consistent themes, common images that just pop up again and again.
Like those phrases we just mentioned. I received more than I gave.
Yep. I was changed.
People are the same everywhere.
And the photos, too, right? The team photos with locals, everyone usually smiling.
Oh, yeah. And the shots of North Americans doing some kind of manual labor.
Right. It almost becomes like a visual shorthand for what an STM is.
So what we're doing here is looking at how these common stories, these dominant narratives, as the source calls them,
Dominant narrative.
how they get built and what they choose to emphasize.
And crucially, what they sometimes overlook or downplay.
Okay.
And the author points out these narratives aren't monolithic. They actually change depending on, the situation where they're being shared.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Our source material talks about the difference between, say, a formal presentation like back at the church youth group versus just chatting one-on-one afterwards. What stands out about that difference?
Well, it's fascinating, actually, how the setting really shapes the story. The author observed a youth group presentation by two participants, Henry and Emma, and the emphasis there was very much on the tangible stuff, the work they did.
Right, the building, the activities.
Yeah, their time with the kids at La Casa and this place called Gato Negro. That, and also their personal spiritual growth.
Okay.
That feeling that they saw God working in the Dominican Republic.
Right.
And Henry even mentioned feeling like they were a great witness, that the local kids learned just from watching their actions.
So that public setting, it encourages focusing on the positive outcomes.
Exactly. The successes, and also, crucially, encouraging other people to sign up for the next trip.
Right, it's almost like a sales pitch in a way.
A little bit, yeah. It functions that way. But the author also managed to have more private chats later on.
And did the story change then?
Well, change might be strong, but a more, let's say, nuanced picture started to come through.
Okay.
I mean, the themes of service and sacrifice, they were still really important.
Sure.
But there was also maybe more of a sense of grappling with bigger, more complex things, like poverty, inequality.
Things that are harder to sum up in a quick presentation.
Precisely. That one-on-one context just allows for more, individual reflection, maybe less pressure to stick to the script, so to speak.
Okay, so building on that idea of service, it really does seem central, doesn't it? That act of physical labor, the construction work, gets highlighted so often.
Absolutely. Yeah, the source mentions Mary and Jeannie, who both talked about genuinely enjoying the construction work and feeling like they were making a real tangible difference, helping.
Yeah, you can see the appeal of that.
And Henry echoed that too. He connected their work building a school directly to, providing education for kids who needed it.
It taps into that desire to help in a way you can see and feel.
And the source material also brings in research, like from Kirsten Priest, who studied women's STM trips specifically. Her work found that, service and building relationships with people perceived as poor are really central to how they define the trip.
This idea of the trip being fundamentally about, caring for the needy.
Exactly. That's often the core framing.
So it seems like a key point here is that the narrative often focuses on the act of service and the personal feeling of helping.
Rather than necessarily digging deep into the reasons for the need in the first place.
Right, the socioeconomic stuff.
Yeah, potentially, which might hinder maybe a more complete understanding. And this focus on service connects to how need itself gets framed.
Okay, yeah, let's dig into that framing of need. The source suggests it's often understood more in spiritual or relational ways?
That's a really critical point the author makes.
Hmm.
They note how parents, for instance, often want their kids to go on these trips so they can see how it is elsewhere.
Right, see poverty firsthand.
And then the hope is they'll appreciate what they have back home.
Ah, okay. So the focus is on changing the traveler's perspective.
Yeah, that individual shift. But the author points out this doesn't always translate into a deeper dive into the systemic reasons why things are the way they are. You know, the big picture of poverty.
And that links to another recurring idea, doesn't it? That encountering poverty actually serves as a kind of spiritual lesson for the North Americans.
Exactly. It's a really common theme. The hardship witnessed is often framed as, like, a spiritual teaching moment or even a blessing for the visitor.
A blessing.
Yeah, James, one of the participants, said the trip helped him grow closer to God.
Right.
And Mary observed the strong faith she saw among Christians who were poor, and it made her reflect on her own contentment or lack thereof.
Right.
The author draws this really interesting parallel to, like, a spiritual pilgrimage.
How so?
Where the poor themselves or the situation of poverty kind of becomes the place where the travelers encounter God.
Wow. So the people become almost a means to a spiritual end for the visitor.
That's one interpretation the analysis suggests is present in the narratives, yeah. The experience of witnessing hardship becomes a catalyst for the traveler's spiritual development.
Okay.
And it's not just observation either. Developing relationships is huge.
Ah, yes, the transformational relationships.
Building those personal connections with missionaries, with local people, that's constantly highlighted as a key outcome, a source of real personal change.
You hear those stories all the time. I made this incredible connection with.
Exactly. Jeremy, for example, talked about how welcoming the children were at La Casa.
Right.
And how it hit him that they seemed so happy with, materially very little.
That contrast.
Yeah. And Mary remembered specific kids feeling like she should be more like them, more joyful or content. There was another example from a chapel presentation after a Honduras trip. People shared stories about their work partners.
The people they worked alongside.
Yeah, and how they became like family. There was even a story about a student whose brother had recently died, and he found comfort in the strong faith of his Honduran work partner.
So those relationships are framed as deeply impactful, personally transformative.
Definitely. That's a cornerstone of the narrative.
And then there's the work itself, the idea that the act of service is transformative for the traveler.
Yeah, even if it's maybe not the most efficient way to get the job done.
Right. I was wondering about that.
Well, the rationale presented is interesting. The source quotes Stiles and Stiles, who argue it's more about demonstrating the love of Jesus than about pure efficiency.
Okay.
They acknowledge, hiring local workers might be faster for, say, building a wall.
Sure. And probably better for the local economy, too.
Potentially, yes. But that efficiency isn't seen as the main goal within this framework. Barney Torrance is quoted saying something like, the work is really secondary to the purpose of the trip.
Secondary. To what then?
To the personal change in the participants. That's framed as the primary objective.
So it's more about the traveler's journey.
It often seems that way in the narratives, yes. The intention, the personal impact on the traveler, maybe gets more weight than the long-term impact of the work.
The source had that anecdote about the commodities trader.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Who adopted a child from Bolivia after a trip.
Yeah, and the story focused entirely on his personal transformation through service.
While kind of glossing over the fact that his day job, trading commodities, might have had much larger, possibly negative economic impacts in Bolivia.
Right, that wasn't part of his transformation story as it was told.
Exactly. The focus tends to stay inward, on the individual change, not necessarily outward on, systemic change in the host country.
And Emma's comment about planting seeds, helping the long-term missionaries.
Yeah, that reinforces this idea, too. It's about supporting ongoing work, maybe having an indirect impact, and definitely about that personal growth aspect for the STM team members.
Okay, this gives us a really good sense of what the dominant narrative includes, what it emphasizes. But what about the stuff that gets left out? The source mentions blinders.
Yeah, that's a really critical question. What doesn't quite fit this main story and so gets kind of minimized or ignored?
Like what?
Well, tourism is a big one.
Interesting. Because these trips often do include sightseeing.
They often do. Visiting waterfalls, rafting, beach time. But it seems there was often this awkwardness around it.
Awkwardness.
Yeah, like a sense of guilt, almost. Or feeling like they needed to apologize for enjoying the fun stuff.
Huh. Jeannie's comment is mentioned, right, about it not quite fitting in with the mission trip vibe.
Exactly. Even though she also saw it as, enjoying the fun side and the good parts of Dominican culture, there's a tension there.
So it's like that part doesn't align with the service and sacrifice narrative?
It seems that way. Anne regretted spending time at a resort. She felt she should have been doing more construction.
But someone else, Aaron, thought the relaxation was needed.
Right. So there's disagreement even among participants. But Anne specifically used that phrase, feeling like she had blinders on to anything not directly mission-related.
Blinders, suggesting a very narrow focus.
Yeah, prioritizing that direct service, maybe over other ways of engaging or learning. It ties back to that action focus.
Okay. What else tends to get left out?
Well, related to what we said earlier, there's often a lack of really deep engagement with the political and economic context.
The why behind the poverty they're seeing.
Exactly. The source mentions James again, how he still struggled to understand why the Dominican Republic was poor, even after the trip and taking relevant classes.
Wow.
It's just the dominant narrative, the way the trip itself is structured and talked about, doesn't necessarily push participants towards asking those big questions about, say, globalization or trade policy.
Although Paul did remember something about the U.S. avocado industry affecting Dominican farmers.
He did, yeah. Though apparently he couldn't initially remember where he had heard. It turns out the trip leader had mentioned it. So it shows that information can be present, but maybe it doesn't always get integrated into the main takeaway story unless perhaps someone already has a background or interest in those areas.
So the framework doesn't naturally encourage exploring those systemic issues.
It often seems not to, based on these accounts. And then there's the issue of race.
Ah, right. How did that play out?
Well, it mostly doesn't seem to play out explicitly anyway. It's largely absent from the narratives.
Even when it seems relevant, like with Amina.
Right. Amina was the only black member of the team and apparently drew a lot of attention in the DR because of it.
Okay.
But when asked if it was because she was the only black person, her reaction was described as somewhat dismissive.
Why do you think that is?
Well, the author links this to broader patterns sometimes seen in North American evangelical culture, where there can be a tendency to kind of downplay race, maybe in favor of emphasizing Christian unity, shared faith above all else.
So focusing on what unites people as Christians, rather than differences like race.
That seems to be the tendency described, which, while focusing on unity is valuable, it can also mean that important conversations about how race does impact experiences and interactions might get sidelined.
So the silence around race itself becomes significant.
It raises questions, definitely, like how are racial dynamics influencing things, even if nobody's talking about it? What does that silence tell us about the priorities or maybe the blind spots within that dominant narrative?
So pulling this all together then.
Yeah.
We see this really strong, dominant narrative around STMs.
Yeah, very powerful.
It shapes how people understand the experience, how they talk about it later.
Big emphasis on personal transformation.
Right. Through service, through relationships.
Often framing need in primarily spiritual or relational ways.
And maybe, consciously or not, downplaying other things.
Yeah, like the touristy aspects or the deeper reasons for poverty or racial dynamics.
This deep dive, it really gives a much richer picture, doesn't it, of the complexities under the surface of those seemingly simple STM stories.
Absolutely. It's not just, we went and helped. It's this complex mix of faith, culture, personal journeys, and how stories get told.
And what gets included, what gets left out.
Which leads to, I think, a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
Okay.
Think about the narratives we construct around our own experiences, any experience, really, not just trips like these. How do those stories we tell ourselves and tell others shape our actual understanding?
Right. What might we be overlooking because it doesn't quite fit the neat narrative we've created?
Exactly. And how might actively looking for different viewpoints, different ways of framing things, lead us to, well, new insights, maybe more complete ones?